Today we're going to be talking about ownership. Now, ownership, as far as I'm concerned, is a very important piece to not only maintaining but also operating anything that we use on a day-to-day basis. Uh, and if you see here, you have a picture of different types of transportation modes in which we all use on a day-to-day basis. Now, ownership is going to be important. And the reason why it's important is because it plays a large role in who is ultimately responsible for providing such services to the public. Ownership does not guarantee profit, but ownership does provide flexibility. So through the flexibility that ownership provides, and it requires the responsibility. So you can take a situation like someone who owns a car or even owns a home. If you own a home, then you are responsible for the maintenance of that home. But by owning a home, it also provides you the flexibility that you would have if you rented the home. For instance, by owning a home, you have the flexibility in changing things in the inside of the home or the exterior of the home, or even renting out that home. And you may not have those same type of or that same type of flexibility or allowances if you were just renting. So ownership does not require profit, but it does provide flexibility. And it also provides a balance between flexibility and maintenance. Yet it still provides goods and services at a safe and efficient manner. So all of these things that the government either owns or contracts out for someone else to own, the responsibility, has to be done in a safe and efficient manner for the public. So let's take a look at how ownership in the government sense is basically structured. And we're going to use this as a way to understand transportation ownership within the government. So at the top here, you can see it's the head level, it's the federal government level, and it gets basically transferred down to the more localized level. We'll take the left side first. And so if you look here, you got the executive agency. That can be something like a U.S. Department of Transportation, who manages, oversees, and regulates all the transportation that occurs within the country. Now, that authority gets passed on to a traditional sense of ownership models. Now, it could either be centralized or decentralized. Now, the centralized side, a good example of that would be Amtrak. Amtrak is a centralized ownership because the government owns it and operates it and tries to turn over some type of profit so that it can be used for other things. You can have a decentralized ownership where that responsibility gets passed on to the municipal departments, or you can look at this as a city government. That could also be passed on to a third party. An example of that could be something like a nonprofit organization who wants to provide transportation of the elderly to their medical appointments. And so the government would have a contract with that organization to provide that service to the public or the aging public so that they can get to their appointments in the manner that is sufficient. So let's look at the other side now. The other side of the equation here is you have the privatization route, where you have a public-private ownership where it's shared, or just a private ownership altogether. A private enterprise would be something like, I don't know, the government saying that Uber should now provide public transportation to every American. And so the government basically just allows Uber to take that role. And they could decide to either have it be deregulated or regulated. Because you don't only have Uber, you have Lyft, you have all these ride sharing programs. So they could regulate it, meaning they would have certain rules and laws in place that would prohibit misuse of those entities basically having a monopoly and doing whatever it is that they want. A deregulated market would allow them to, those private firms or those private corporations to basically make their decisions and allow the market to drive their decisions. So rather than have the government impose certain restrictions, um, the private organization would make all of their decisions based on their customers and what their customers are willing to pay and what their customers want. So again, take uh, the example of Uber being part of that private enterprise that's providing that public service, all public transportation, Uber or Lyft, providing all public transportation. In the deregulated market, basically Uber would say, okay, what is it that my customers want? And if my customers want a certain quality of transportation, then we're going to provide that to the customer so that we don't lose out on getting their business. Whereas, let's say they regulated it, they would say, well, we are restricted to only serving between the hours of 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. And so we're regulated between those hours, and that's the only hours that we're going to serve because that's the government, is what the government allows. And so um, there may be a loss of opportunity from a private firm's standpoint because they believe that they can probably make all of their money, I guess, when the bars let out after 10 p.m. So uh, again, deregulated market allows for those decisions to happen a lot easier. You got a private and public ownership. That's when the ownership is shared, and usually it would be shared in terms of someone's going to operate it and someone is going to basically own or foot the bill. And so if you look down here, you have a private ownership or public in a public operation, or you can have a public ownership in a private operation. And so one example of this would be, I guess, the toll roads in Pennsylvania, where the public owns it, but they lease it out to private companies, private organizations to manage when people are getting those, manage the toll booths, basically the cost and manning the employees and making sure that everything is run efficiently. And so the public can still make that declaration of what it is that they want to do, what they want to change, who they want to contract, so they can change the contracts with someone else. Um, because they don't have to have the hassle and worry about manning people to operate those toll booths because they own it and they just hire and contract out private operation. So here's one more look of what I just said. So why is all this important? Well, we know that the ownership of anything would allow the person who owns it or the entity that owns it the flexibility to do what it is with the property that they own. So, for instance, if the government owns the land or the transportation facility or infrastructure, it provides them the flexibility to do what it is that they would like to do with that facility. But if it's renting it out, if it's leasing it, or if someone is leasing it from the government, then they don't have that flexibility without the government's permission. So let's take an example. So I-81 corridor, I don't know if you can see this, but this is the Stanton district of the I-81 corridor improvement plan. And that plan was passed recently. And kind of zoom in here, you'll be able to see that there's a certain amount of cost associated with improving this I-81 corridor, right? And you can kind of see the cost over here. Now, overall, the cost is over $2 billion. And so everything adds up. You can see that you got 11.24 million here to rebuild the road, Redbud the road onto Route 11, a realignment of the off ramp. You have different types of off ramps that need to be modified, and so these prices basically add up over time. And this is just for the Stanton district. of I-81, although the improvement plan was for the entire Virginia owned I-81 property. So what does all this mean? This means that because VDOT owns that section of I-81, it has the ability to vote on what it's going to do along that section, and not only what it's going to do, but how it will pay for it. And so they've come up with many different ideas and many different plans. This most recent plan has been shared, so I can share it as well. And here's how they plan on funding this. It was already voted on. So they're going to use truck registration fees. They're going to use taxes on the fuel, and also they'll also increase taxes on fuel that's not diesel for the folks who travel along that route. That's basically how they decided to fund this $2 billion project to improve I-81. To be more specific, here's how this plan breaks down. So you have 33 million registration and fees, 69 million, 62 million with regional fuel tax. Again, just for the people who use that area or that portion of I-81, just to, I guess, to be fair. Overall, most of that funding is going to come from the, again, fees, taxes, and regional fees. And over the first 10 years, that's about how much they will be able to access, or at least generate, from those increased fees so that I-81 can be improved. So to recap, ownership does not guarantee profit, but it does provide flexibility, and it also requires responsibility so that the folks or the people who are using the thing in which you own are using it and can use it in a safe and efficient manner. And because of that ownership that the Virginia Department of Transportation has, they're able to identify locations that they would like to change and also specify how they are going to pay for it based on the people who are using or estimated to use that location. Without that ownership, they wouldn't have that flexibility to make those decisions. How they're going to pay and generate that income so that the project can be built at a much faster pace, well, that all depends on how they would like to access that funding. There's a couple of ways. It can be provided just by the general fund that exists within the state. The project can be accelerated based on taking out debt, essentially, through bonds. But there are multiple ways in which this project can happen a lot faster, as opposed to waiting those 10 years just to begin the process. And so bonding or some type of debt repayment plan is usually a good way and a typical way it's done.